Hey, hi, how are you? Welcome back to the e-learning series on hazard identification, assessment, and control. Now, things are a bit different here. In this segment, we're going to cover something different, okay? What we're going to cover is controlling risk with hazard controls and, of course, understanding those controls. Now, previously, we dove into hazards, risks, and consequences. Now we have an understanding of only part of the hazard identification and assessment process. Part of the process, but not all of it. So now what we need to look at is controls. First, though, we got to go over a few terms. There's a couple of terms to consider. So let's talk about those now. First, dangerous. Dangerous is simply a situation full of danger, whereas unsafe is a situation without safety. Looking at it more in depth, unsafe is the presence of an uncontrolled hazard or hazards. Then we need to control those hazards. It only makes sense. However, danger is not bothering to identify or assess hazards. Essentially, it's being careless, reckless, and negligent. Controls, on the other hand, or control, means to direct or guide or to determine the behavior or direction of. Portions of different definitions of control state things like direct or to guide or to determine the behavior or direction of, so I simply combined it into that complete definition, which is to direct, guide, to determine the behavior or direction of. Another way to think of a hazard is to think of an uncontrolled or unmanaged, potentially harmful force or energy. And what we need to do is control and manage it. Now, another definition of control is to nullify or significantly reduce the potential for the negative effect of hazard exposure. So once again, think of a hazard as something that has the potential for a negative effect on anyone or anything it interacts with, resulting in injury or illness to people, damage to property and or assets, or harm to the environment. Now, that being the case, a control is essentially anything or process that nullifies or significantly reduces that potential for a negative effect on or anyone or anything it interacts with by directing or guiding it, redetermining the behavior or direction of the hazard or the potentially harmful force. So we use controls, and there are different categories of controls, and within those categories, different types. However, we need to consider the best way to apply those controls. So we have what's called the hierarchy of controls, from the top down in order of the importance or preference, if you will. So looking at them now, we have elimination, which is eliminating the hazard or the potential for exposure to the hazard, which of course may require a modification of the task, in which case the assessment process would start over completely. Next, we have substitution, which is substituting the hazard for something less hazardous. Think getting rid of a caustic cleaner for a less harmful cleaner. Once again, may also require modification of the task and may also require a brand new assessment. Now, next is an engineering control, and we're going to examine all of these controls in depth. But with engineering, we're establishing a barrier between the exposed worker and the hazard as close to the hazard source as possible. Think guarding on a moving blade, for instance. Next, we have administration, and that's anything that influences or directs worker behavior. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then finally, the last on the list is PPE, things that are worn or attached to the worker to minimize the effects of exposure to that hazard. So looking at each one, elimination is not eliminating the task altogether, it's eliminating the hazard associated with the task. It's not necessarily eliminating that task completely, it may even be a change to the working environment. And we'll look a bit more at this in a bit. But let's look at some variations of additional controls, engineering controls. So with engineering controls, once again, we're establishing a barrier between the exposed worker and the hazard and having that as close to the hazard as possible to reduce risk. Having it as close to the hazard and as close to the hazard source as possible is a tantamount. But it also might mean pulling the hazard away from the worker. Now, this before you isn't an exhaustive list for the simple reason everything is advancing, and what I say now may of course change in the future. But think of the definition of establishing a barrier between the exposed worker and the hazard. So, isolation is separating the workers from the hazard at a distance or by use of barriers. So, think of picture a screen separating a worker from a manufacturing process, or a glass, plexiglass or Lexan barrier between a worker and the manufacturing process. Guards and shields are another form of engineering control, and they, using guards around moving parts or machinery, form an engineering control. Picture a blade guard on a circular saw, for instance, as a simple one. Or we can also use an enclosure, which is placing the material or process in a closed system. For example, in enclosed machines or booths, or you may see a parts cleaning machine where a person will stick their hand in the gloves and then clean off parts, so they're completely separated. So once again, enclosed machines, booths, containers, etc. Now the next is ventilation, which is using local exhaust or general dilution ventilation to remove or reduce airborne products. So welding arms positioned over what the welder's welding are a good example. Or dust extraction in a cabinetry shop. Another thing, of course, is mechanical aid. In these aids in pushing, pulling, or lifting. Using mechanical aid methods to push, pull, or move objects instead of manual force further reduces risk. I kind of skipped a bit. We want to come back. Interlocks. An interlock is a feature that makes the state of two mechanisms or functions mutually dependent. It may consist of any electrical or mechanical devices or systems. In most applications, an interlock is used to help prevent any damage to the machine or to the operator handling the machine. Now, a really quick example, I'm doing laundry today, is how the washing machine door needs to be closed for it to work. Or you having to put your foot on the brake before moving the transmission into gear. Those are some simple examples of engineering controls. Let's move on to administrative controls. Administrative controls are anything that influences or directs worker behavior. Administrative controls, by the way, are the only one constant that is always present when controlling hazards. Once again, this is not an exhaustive list. Things change. But the very first one is work direction documents. These can be safe work documents, safe work procedures, safe work instructions, policy, etc. Documents designed to direct how a worker behaves. The next is work design, which may be shift schedules, work planning, or even altering how workers are moving in an area. That's work design. And then next is training. Now, whether this is work-required training, such as being a journeyman electrician for doing electrical work, or simply training on how to do something in a safe manner, such as how to set up a workstation using ergonomic principles. We have signage, and signage provides, it's one of the most simplest ways of providing instruction, such as you might see it as hearing protection worn beyond this point, or hearing and eye protection must be worn beyond this point. Another form of administrative control is audible and visible indicators. These are lights, bells, whistles, etc. And these are, believe it or not, also administrative controls as they adjust worker behavior. So believe it or not, a fire alarm is an administrative control. Backup beeper on a machine is administrative control because they adjust worker behavior by saying, move, get out of the way. One other thing to think about is controls can be combined, and they can be combined, and one of these combinations is called process control, and process control or process control method, which is simply combining substitution, engineering, and administrative controls together. Think using a wet method instead of a dry method to reduce airborne particulate, or using high-pressure steam instead of place of solvents. These are once again, a process control. Now, finally, PPE, or personal protective equipment. This is the lowest on the hierarchy of controls, but also it's most commonly used. PPE is considered the lowest on the hierarchy of controls for a few reasons. It's worn next to the worker, so think closest to the worker but further away from the hazard source. PPE also requires worker intervention to function, whereas engineering controls often function independent of the worker. And finally, PPE wears out faster and requires a replacement process to be functional. Some examples to think about are respiratory protection, whether they be N95 masks worn in a clinical setting or respirators. There's also skin protection, for example, coveralls, aprons, full body suits. Gloves, for obvious reasons, we need hand protection. And then you have eye protection, which could be a face shield, goggles, but even something as simple as shatterproof glasses that also reduce glare. Next on that, of course, is foot protection. Hard-toed boots, steel-toed boots, etc. These can be foot protection, but also you can have gaiter guards, etc. Those are considered foot protection. And then finally, we have hearing protective devices, which are earplugs, ear muffs, ear protection. These are all PPE. Now, one of the most important things that we need to think about and consider is we can't assume. So don't assume that all controls will work the first time. Before the attaboys and high fives start flying around, you have to ask yourself some questions about your controls. Have the controls effectively eliminated or reduced worker exposure? Have the controls created new hazards? And if that's the case, are new hazards appropriately controlled? Are there any other methods required, such as training to use those controls? Are workers trained on the control methods? Will the new controls be constant? Changes to the workplace dynamics or environment might affect them. Just some things to think about and consider. There's always going to be a loss. So depending on your own internal processes, the best practice is to reevaluate risk after implementing controls. Doing so helps to identify possible gaps and reduce potential loss. Hazard assessment allows for the typical cycle that we use in safety. It's very similar to the Deming cycle of plan, do, check, act. But when we're going through the hazard assessment, we use basically something that's called an order of operations, which is the very first thing is we identify hazards. So we assess tasks that are being performed, and we look at those tasks and we identify the hazards associated with those tasks. Then the next thing we do is we assess for risk. And we do that with a quantification method. Rather than just being anecdotal, we give risk a numerical value. And then what we do is we look at the risk and we look at the hazards and we implement controls. We implement controls using that hierarchy of controls, elimination first or substitution, and then engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. But knowing the controls aren't going to work every single time, or they might not work on a consistent basis, we're going to reevaluate. So to sum it up thus far, hazard assessment is not a one and done. Continuous improvement is what drives a successful hazard identification, assessment, and control program. You can't perform hazard assessments and then hope that the process ends there. The workplace is constantly changing. Therefore, the hazard assessment process needs to be repeated at reasonable intervals. So here we are, quiz time. If you're watching this on YouTube, and if you're not subscribed already, you should click that button down below and click subscribe. That way, when the next video launches, you'll get notified. Oh, provided you click the little bell as well. Now, if you're on the e-learning platform, there's a short quiz that you'll need to complete to ensure that this module is complete. Once that's done, you can move on to the next module, which is the formal job hazard assessment. Oh, and you folks on YouTube, while you're at it, you can check out this video up here if you want. Now, remember, safety leaders, folks, being a leader means embracing continuous improvement, striving to improve and making your workplace safer. Because when we have a safer workplace, a healthier workplace, then everybody's more productive. Okay, take care. Bye for now.